Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you a long-awaited video. I probably should have made this when I finished Night of the Living Dummy 3 a while back, and I totally blanked that I could have done this, but better late than never. I'm going to be ranking all 6 R.L. Stine specials from the original Goosebumps show, from least best to best. Now, this video will be just my opinion. You don't have to agree with my opinion. I totally understand that all of these episodes that I'm going to be discussing are pretty much in the same ballpark. So before we go any further, pause the video. Let me know down in the comment section how you would rank all 6 of these stories from least best to best in your own opinion. Now, with that being said, for those of you that don't understand what I mean by R.L. Stine specials, back in the original show that ran from 1995 to 1998, the first 2 seasons got 3 R.L. Stine TV specials a season. And R.L. Stine came on, filmed for the show and whatnot for these episodes with an intro and an outro to kind of begin and send off the special. And these specials would go on to pretty much be the center of this VHS line that they had going on in the 90s. And the VHS line didn't just stick with these 6 specials, which were all 2-parters. They also branched off here and there. In the original line, there was a 7th tape called Stay Out of the Basement, which was a regular 2-parter from season 1 that a lot of people, including myself, often confused as a Stine special for many years. But, you know, that's just a false memory because I owned most of these tapes as a kid and I just assumed that it had one, but it doesn't. And that's fine and all, but as a kid, I really believed that. And that was pretty much, you know, with the 6 R.L. Stine specials, the original VHS line. And then Ultimate Goosebumps came out and tried their own line. It didn't have near as much. They only had 3 tapes. They had Bride of the Living Dummy and An Old Story. They had the 2-parters of One Day at Horrorland and Werewolf Skin. And that was it. But the 6 specials, right? I feel like I should list them here. In season 1, you had The Haunted Mask, which was a 2-parter. You had A Night in Terror Tower, which was a 2-parter. And Werewolf of Fever Swamp, which was a 2-parter. And then in season 2, you had The Haunted Mask, another 2-parter. Welcome to Dead House, another one. And then Night of the Living Dummy 3, which was also another one. So, these 6 episodes, I should say, or these 6 2-parters, are easily some of the most popular episodes of the entire series. And I think that it has a lot to do with like 3 main factors. One, when they were TV specials, there was a lot of ads for them. There was a lot of hype. If you've ever watched commercial compilations from Fox Kids and you've seen a TV special ad, there's just more emphasis that you need to watch it. And it goes all the way back to the very first one, which was The Haunted Mask, which was the inaugural episode of the whole show. There was a huge spectacle, and that episode was so popular, they kept the tradition going for the first 2 seasons. But I guess by the time they got to Ultimate Goosebumps, I don't know if getting Stine on camera was becoming an issue or less lucrative for the team. I don't know. But they did away with it, and, you know, it's kind of a shame. But most fans will tell you that these 6 are probably going to be in everybody's top 10, or every casual's top 10. I don't think that the diehard fans will have all 6 of these in their top 10 episodes or anything. I don't personally myself, but that's just me. I'm not saying that doesn't apply to you. But these are so influential that they have the power, I would even say Stay Out of the Basement to an extent as well, to confuse fans that read the books in the episodes, because when they watch the episode, they genuinely believe these events happen in the book as well, and that's just not the case. Good examples of that are like Haunted Mask 2, The Werewolf of Fever Swamp, Night of the Living Dummy 3. People confuse those 3 a lot. Even Stay Out of the Basement, which is more subtle changes than the other 3, but that one gets confused a lot too. That might be a separate talk video now that I'm thinking about it. I might set that aside for another rainy day. But without further ado, I want to get into my ranking. And, you know, I feel bad because a lot of these are in the same ballpark. If not all of these are in the same ballpark. I can see arguments where one episode should be higher for some people. They might say that, or one should be lower. I totally get it. Like I said early on in the video, Just let me know what your thoughts are on these. So, we'll start at number 6. This one, I felt the same way since I was a kid. I owned the VHS of this as a child. It was definitely my least played one. And as a kid, I didn't really get that much enjoyment out of this as much as the ones I did own. I owned Bride of the Living Dummy and An Old Story. I owned One Day at Horrorland from the Ultimate Goosebumps line. Then I owned 6 out of the 7 original line. The only one I didn't own was Night of the Living Dummy 3. But the ones I didn't own, like Werewolf Skin and Dummy 3, I would just rent. But this one was definitely my least played one. And I guess today, when I reviewed this, I gave this a 4.4 out of 5. Which is a B tier. I think this is the only R.L. Stine special that's in the B tier. It's a B plus, though. And it goes to A Night in Terror Tower. A Night in Terror Tower, I think it was directed by William Fruitt, written by Dan Angel and Billy Brown. You have strong directing, strong writing. You have a strong setting, a good cast leading the main characters. You have Catherine Short, and you have Corey Sevier playing the main characters, Sue and Eddie. And this is easily one of the most faithful of the R.L. Stine specials. Essentially, all the way up until the climax, I would say, is pretty much shot for shot the book. Give or take maybe 1 or 2 scenes that they kind of tweaked or did completely differently, or they might have added in. And that's kind of my problem with it. A Night in Terror Tower easily looks like it has one of the higher budgets of the entire series. It's well made. Like I said, there's just a lot going for it. It has some original music in there, and it's one of those original music episodes that people tend to like. They're kind of sprinkled in the series. But it's just too much like the book, and it has a lot of the book's sins going for it. For me, it's the endless chase scenes that kind of plague the book are in here. Now, there are kind of condensed because this is an episodic format. This is 44 minutes altogether, but it's still a problem in the plot. And the story just doesn't diversify itself enough throughout the majority of it to make this a revisitable alternative, other than the climax and ending, which I think is way better than the book, because this actually provides a genuine climax with not introducing disbelief you got to put out the door with a certain character with some heavy padding and plot convenience going on. I think this is a better way to end it, and because that's really the only discernible thing I can kind of separate from the book, this is why I prefer the episode over the book. I will compare all these to the book when I can, or I will, I guess, but this is easily better than its book counterpart. And I think a lot of fans would agree with me on that. It's just a little more condensed, but the problems, like I say, it just doesn't diversify itself from the book, and it doesn't really fix the sins of it, so it just kind of lands here by default, unfortunately. But still a great special. I will say, in terms of the opening and ending of the episodes with R.L. Stine's bits, the opening to this one is not one of my favorites, but the ending is kind of fun. So there's that. So that's number 6. At number 5, this one, when I reviewed it, I think I gave this a 4.7 out of 5, which is a A tier, kind of just a flat A. This currently is my favorite Night of the Living Dummy or slappy story ever made. And that might be controversial, but I'm just speaking my own truths. And I kind of might have spoiled myself here, but it goes to Night of the Living Dummy 3. This was directed by Timothy Bond and written by Neil Shusterman. And Neil Shusterman, I think, did a phenomenal job on the scripts he did write for the show, because he brought something totally different to the stories he adapted. And Timothy Bond, he directed Haunted Mask 1. He's a fantastic director. I think he's probably my second favorite next to William Fruitt, which some people would say Timothy Bond's the best, but he's like my second favorite. But yeah, Night of the Living Dummy 3, compared to its book counterpart, it diversifies the story completely. I think the book I gave like a 3.9 out of 5. And my main issue with Dummy 3's book is that it's so plot formulaic to those first two dummy books, and there's not a lot of diversification going on, especially with the midpoint reveal being all for nothing because Slappy was already awakened and it's just all pranks. Why waste Slappy like that, right? And that kind of bleeds into the ending. Here, it's kind of like the same setup as the book. Slappy gets activated in the beginning, but they utilize Slappy pretty much from the get-go. They utilize the same characters. You have Trina, Dan, and Zane. Zane famously is played by Hayden Christensen, who went on to play Anakin Skywalker in the Star Wars prequels. It's memorable for that, but that's not why this is iconic. I think why it's iconic is that there's multiple dummies in the Dummy 3 book that I feel like were very underutilized, but in the episode, more so with one particular side dummy called Rocky, there's a lot more screen presence with these dummies. And Slappy has a brand new power written into his character that you pretty much only get exclusively in this episode. Maybe you might get some hints of it in Goosebumps 2 Haunted Halloween, which was the second theatrical movie. But this idea with Slappy is a fan favorite. And in case you don't know, Slappy has the power to turn kids into dummies. This is just a very fun episode. You can tell so much heart was put into it. The atmosphere is great. The acting ensemble is fun. Slappy's voice actor, I think this is a Carl Dodd one, where he voices Slappy. He did a fantastic job. Absolutely fantastic job. The only problem I really have with this episode, and why I put it here, compared to the other 4 above it, is the visual presentation of Slappy. There is very jarring transition scenes of Slappy going from this little person wearing a costume to a dummy. And he looks way bigger than his other episode counterparts, and I kind of attribute that to, the show trying to make a bigger scale Slappy story, trying to use more dynamic camera work, showing his character. You can't do close pan-in shots like you did with Night of the Living Dummy 2 and Bride of the Living Dummy. I get that. But it is kind of jarring here. And that's really the big negative. I mean, it's just the presentation kind of throws me off. But story-wise, I absolutely love this adaptation. So don't take anything away by me putting it here. I still love it. It's definitely a top 10 episode contender for me. So there's that. And at number 4, I feel bad because in my book versus episode, I gave this episode a 5 out of 5, and the book counterpart a 4.8, and I said the episode is better. But since then, I have definitely reevaluated my opinions on this, and I have retroactively bumped this episode down to a 4.8 for one glaring thing, and I'll get into that in a minute. So it's kind of even with the book in terms of points, but if I had to say which one I prefer, I think I prefer the book over this one. This is the only Stine 2-parter that I prefer the book over the episode counterpart. That being said, I still love this, and it's probably still in my top 10 of the whole show. And it goes to Welcome to Deadhouse. Welcome to Deadhouse's episode. It can't get as dark as the book. There are some very graphic mutilation scenes in Welcome to Deadhouse, especially dealing with like skin melting off and stuff. You just can't do that in this show. They couldn't get away with it. The show did try to remedy that with just zombies turning into ash or vampires turning into ash, whatever these Dark Falls residents are. But I will say this about this episode. The family. There's something about the cast of the family. I think it's the Benson family, I want to say. They have this Amityville Horror-esque quality to it. And, I don't know what it is, but they just look like they would be actors in a legitimate horror movie. You have, in my opinion, the most spot-on setting choice in Goosebumps history. Maybe next to an episode right above this one. But this is perfect. Dark Falls is essentially the character villain of the Welcome to Deadhouse story. And they nailed the setting here. For a low-budget show filmed in Canada, you cannot get as perfect as this setting. And the mood to this, easily the darkest toned episode in the entire show. Bar none. It's just a gloomy atmosphere And it's so memorable. There's great performances from the Darkfall denizens. The most famous one is the construction worker, which was not in the book, played by Scott Wickware, who also played the Masked Mutant in the Attack of the Mutant two-parter in Season 2. And you have more characters kind of thrown into the ring that we don't really get to see much of in the book, like Karen Thurston and the Thurston family that lives next door. There's a lot more deviations to the book to really enjoy in the episode over it. And in a lot of ways, I do prefer the episode over it. However, my one glaring issue of why I put this below the book now is there's this plot mechanism introduced in the episode that involves a good luck wreath that the Benson family hangs above their fireplace that implies it has some type of magical ability to fend off the Darkfall denizens, who are kind of zombie vampire hybrid creatures trying to suck the blood of people moving into this house that they lure in. Yeah, it goes that dark. The wreath thing makes no sense. It wasn't in the book. There's no real reason why it's in there other than to kind of deter the neighbors, the Thurstons, from attacking them sooner, I guess. But there's legit no reason. It's kind of random why it's in there. Now, the book's biggest sin, I'm going to kind of throw that out there. Compton Dawes, I guess the big villain of the Darkfall denizens in the book, there's a loose thing that happens with him in the climax and the ending that pisses a lot of fans off. It pisses me off. I know it makes BD Horror mad as well. That's easily the biggest issue there. So when comparing it, you just have a little plot issue, trying to, mull over Compton Dawes in the book. And then you have the wreath mechanism that just makes no sense and is more random. Which one's more egregious? I think it's the wreath. That's why, if I had a preference, I'd prefer the book. But in a lot of ways, they're kind of even. But I have it here. It's still a phenomenal episode. Easily a top 10er for me from the show. So there's that. And now we're entering my top 3. And all 3 of these are 5 out of 5s, okay? I'm just going to throw it out there. My number 3 and my number 2 can honestly interchange at any point. And I just recently rewatched all 3 of these for the Halloween season. I'm about to rewatch all 3 of these because they're on Netflix, of course. But I'm going to be watching these for the Halloween season as well. But I watched this episode and I've loved this ever since I was a kid. This is just one of those situations where the show absolutely nailed so many things it needed to nail. There's subtle changes that really improve the story of the book. And in my opinion, this is, points-wise, not too far away from the book, but it is, by a few hairs, better. And it goes to The Werewolf of Fever Swamp. Like I said, this is a 5 out of 5. The book is more of like a 4.7 out of 5. But that's also inflated with nostalgia I have with the book. That was my very first Goosebumps book I ever read. If I'm being honest, without the nostalgia, I'd probably give Fever Swamp maybe like a 4.3 or 4.2 out of 5. In terms of, just being, without the bias. But this episode is fantastic. This was another William Fruitt episode. It was written by Neil Shusterman. Now, I don't know if I mentioned who did Welcome to Dead House. Dan Angel and Billy Brown and William Fruitt. Okay, so William Fruitt and Dan Angel and Billy Brown teamed up for this one. Makes sense. But this team up here, Neil Shusterman, did it again with writing a 2-parter for this show. You have Brendan Fletcher playing Grady. And I think honestly, next to Catherine Long playing Carly Beth, Brendan Fletcher's performance as Grady is the best performance in the entire show, bar none, next to Catherine Long. And that's saying a lot. The family, I think it's a Tucker family. They were all great actors. They all played their characters perfectly and how they needed to play them. And when I say the show, I don't know how they did this in Canada of all places, but they found a Florida-looking swamp in Canada. And when I say that this swamp is more better than I could have imagined the book, I really mean that. I mean, this is a fantastic nail on the head of the book. You know, you couldn't pick a better way to bring this book alive. And what I also love about the episode, right? You cut out filler characters like Cassie. And Cassie, some people have gone on to love her character. I know she was included in the spin-off comic from IDW, Secrets of the Swamp. And if you're a fan of that, that's fine. But not having Cassie in the episode, you don't really miss her. Will Blake's actor, I recognize him as an Are You Afraid of the Dark actor. Will Blake's actor, you know, might be one of the bigger misses from this episode. But he still did a great job. Not my first choice, but, you know, he still does a fantastic job. And I will say this. I forget his last name, but I think his name is Don something. The guy who plays the Swamp Hermit in this episode. He played the sheriff in the original My Bloody Valentine movie from the 1980s, which was like a slasher. He brought it with the Swamp Hermit. The Swamp Hermit character, when I was a child, scared me so bad. And what they add to his character in this episode, with this lore and backstory to him that the book just didn't have. You have him, you know, out there living in the woods as a hermit because, you know, the werewolf killed his family, and he's living out there pretty much like a savage just so he can get revenge on the werewolf, right? And the setting, you know, the episode pretty much puts the Tucker family into like this cul-de-sac of just 3 houses. You have disheveled houses everywhere. And it is something so eerie. There's like a movie quality going on here with this. And the second act, oh my lord, easily, the best shot episode of the entire show goes to part 2 of this episode. Without a shred of a doubt. I loved some subtle changes here as well. In terms of the name of the dog in the story, I think in the book it's called Wolf. Here it's called Vandal. Cooler name. And then the ending itself, which might be the biggest point of contention for a lot of you out there, whether you think this is better than the book. Some people really love the ending. I'm not shaming you for it. I like the ending of the book. But the episode, I love how ingenious it is at being ambiguous. Because it's one of the few times in Goosebumps history where it actually leaves 2 very, very plausible outcomes that you can wrap your mind around. One outcome is that Grady just got stricken by the fever of Fever Swamp, and imagine all of this in a fever dream. I mentioned this in an urban legend video a while back, one of my most popular videos. Or the second avenue is that he actually did go through all of this, and he is implied to be stricken with lycanthropy, right? It's perfect for being an ambiguous ending. You can hate it all you want, you can dislike it. I dig it. I think it's a perfect episode from start to finish. And it can honestly go, it depends on my mood if I like this more than my number 2. But that can also be said with my number 2, it can also go to my number 1. I've loved this episode so much since I was a child. You have no idea. This was the gateway to Goosebumps for me. I've watched this tape so many times growing up. It's easily my most consumed story in Goosebumps history. Now, my love of it over the years, you know, when I made my book versus episode, you know, comparison video for this specific story, I kind of tied them. But if I had a slight preference, I prefer the book. And it's because of one little scene in the episode, honestly. But it goes to The Haunted Mask. The Haunted Mask is a 5 out of 5 story. I think that book is a 5 out of 5. And I think for the most part they're tied. But like I said, I slightly prefer the book. The episode has its mild change-ups to the book. And I do see this one getting confused a lot in the fandom. And I can kind of see who's just watched the episode and who's read the book. Like, for example, in the book, there is a fair display at school, like a science fair, that's completely cut out of the episode. The episode kind of replaces that with a pumpkin patch scene. The pumpkin patch scene does not happen in the book. There is a graveyard scene with Chuck and Steve that happens in the episode, does not happen in the book. Right? And there might be a few other change-ups, but those are pretty much the significant ones. But what scene I'm referring to is because they changed up Chuck and Steve being in the graveyard, there is kind of a mild cringe moment with Chuck and Steve. in the episode that these days I find myself kind of wincing at. And I normally didn't do that for a while, but I guess because I've been engrossing myself in so much Goosebumps lately, it kind of sticks out. But that being aside, this is a fantastic, fantastic episode. This was written by Jose Rivera and directed by Timothy Bond. When I say that this is pretty much a masterpiece, I mean it. Catherine Long playing Carly Beth, most iconic performance in the whole show, bar none. Catherine Short, that's kind of funny. Catherine Long and Catherine Short, both spelled the same way, for their first name Catherine. Catherine Short playing Sabrina. I forget the guy who plays Chuck's name, but he's in the Haunted Mask 2 episode, right? He's fantastic. Voice cracking and all that. It's just something about it. It might annoy me with some other actors, but he does it fine. The Steve we know in this episode doesn't go on to Haunted Mask 2, but even he's fine for what they're trying to do. This sets up such an emotional story. The guy who plays the shop owner, I always forget his name too, played the shop owner perfectly. The masks that they brought to the shop as well are leaps and bounds better than what you would get in the book cover. The book cover, you got the yellow eyes and, creepy green mask, right? Then you turn it over on the back and you see this creepy mask. I would pull down my mask, but they're hanging on my shelf and I didn't really think of doing that for this, but you get the gist. The masks in this terrified me as a child. And I always was able to kind of see Carly Beth's struggle because the story is so universal that even younger kids can kind of grasp what's going on. She's being bullied by her peers. She's struggling with her own self-love. She wants to be something else that she isn't for once in her life. And now she has to reap what she's sown for herself. It's just a powerful emotional story. Fantastic acting all the way around. The setting, I am not kidding that they made the perfect, idealistic trick-or-treat neighborhood for Halloween in this episode. So much so that I held this as the gold standard of how neighborhoods should look on Halloween as a kid. And when my neighbors didn't decorate for Halloween like my family did, I went and chastised them and I said, look, we got to make a good neighborhood for these trick-or-treaters because this episode just showed me the light. There's just so much heart and soul in this. I can't stress it to you. There are some things about the plot that if you look at the play-by-play and not the big picture, it might be an issue. I could totally see why some people might have some issues with some cringy moments and mild poor delivery of humor. But I can overlook those small, tiny things. They're not really that big for me. So, yeah, this is a perfect episode in my opinion. But not as perfect as number one. And my number one is pretty much a runaway. And it goes to the one that's left. The Haunted Mask 2. Which is another 5 out of 5. This was a William Fruit episode written by Neil Shusterman. It seems like every time Neil Shusterman writes a two-parter in the story, it perks my ears. But when I say that Haunted Mask 2 is the best episode, the scariest episode, the most dynamic episode of the R.L. Stine specials and of the whole series, I mean it. This is such a fantastic piece of kids' horror media. And why I put this one above Haunted Mask 1, it can honestly flip-flop, but I put this one here because this is the quintessential replacement for the book. I know the book has its fans. I see a lot more people these days coming around on Haunted Mask 2. And I've always stood up for Haunted Mask 2's book. I want to make that perfectly clear. I gave the book a 4.7 out of 5. I feel like I'm being very fair on that book. I don't think it's quite perfect like some people do. I think it does have some mild issues. But it's a very scary, intense book. Not taking anything away from it, but the episode, I think, just makes the story so much better. And a lot of people will agree. I do think that some people out there try to bolster up their opinion about the book with the episode, and I think that's a misattribution because the episode is essentially a whole different take on the Haunted Mask 2 story, pretty much wholesale. It's not even close to what the book is. And I think that's for the better, though. You have arguably two, main character focuses. You have Carly Beth, who's returning from Haunted Mask 1. You have her, growing from the events of the first episode, and you get some sort of continuity out of that. She's grown braver. She's grown more self-confident. But she is still precautious about the trauma she went through in the mask, but she's not letting that be the forebearer of her personality, right? And then you have Steve Boswell, who was recasted in this. He's played by John White, who played Michael Webster in the Cuckoo Clock of Doom episode from season 1. Steve, it has a completely different arc than the book. In the book, he just wants some revenge on these soccer kids that have pestered him, but in the episode, he just wants one last Halloween before his adolescence is over to be able to go trick-or-treating and scare kids and have fun. One last time. One last hoorah before he gets too old. And if you can't tell by the mask, him getting an old man mask from the same shop, even though the shop is also recasted in its own right, he gets the old man mask, and it fits the symbology more so than the book did. But the biggest standout changes you'll notice, I think, is Chuck Green. He's more superfluous in the book. He's more of a main character here, and the kid who plays Chuck delivered one of my favorite supporting character performances of all time in Goosebumps. And the change up to the villain. There's actually a shared villain now. You have the shopkeeper getting possessed by Carly Beth's mask that she tried to dispose of in the first episodes, where we don't see what happens because of the twist involving Noah, her little brother, potentially wearing the mask. We don't see what happens, but she tells us, so it at least bridges the gap. And we have the shop owner wearing the haunted mask, trying to get to Carly Beth, and using Steve, who has put the mask on 3 times, has gone past the point of no return, going through way more grisly body horror than Carly Beth did ever in the first episode. He comes to Steve and gives him a proposition he can't refuse. You help me hold Carly Beth down so I can possess her, and I'll set you free from the mask. That was his get out of jail free card. And Steve has a character growth moment where he sees Carly Beth finally near the clutches of this shopkeeper's, and he throws himself in harm's way to save her, even though in his mind he thought he's going to be stuck in the mask. He didn't want Carly Beth to suffer the same fate as him. So Steve has a great arc. One of the best, I think one of the best turnarounds of kids in the Goosebumps show. Like I said, the dynamicism of the shifting point of views make it way more engaging throughout this 2-parter. I think the effects department went out of their way, even though this is a low budget 90s show, they went out of their way to make a scary product here. And I truly feel this way. And I'll always stick by this. There is just so much about dichotomy going on with the first episode that I feel like when people kind of come down on this episode specifically, I feel like they're being unfair. Most people say, oh, they're going into the rehash. You have a kid getting possessed by a mask, but it's a new mask. That's just a little cheap and unfair to say, because Steve, when you put on paper what Carly Beth was going through with the mask and her motives, they are completely different than what Steve's motives are putting on a mask. And besides that, the masks operate totally differently. You have one mask that brings out the evil in a kid, and you have one that turns him into an old man, makes him have spiders, makes him old, frail, and weak, right? There's 2 totally different dichometric stories going on. Basically, what Carly Beth's story is, you're offering a good versus evil story, while Haunted Mask 2 is a little more deptual. You have evil struggling with more evil, trying to surpass that and grow and change and be better, right? So, 2 totally different products. I feel like the criticism of Haunted Mask 2's episode is kind of unfair, but easily my favorite episode of the whole show. The atmosphere is just as perfect as Haunted Mask 1, in my opinion. I think the humor lands a whole lot more. I think Neil Shusterman's writing is a little bit better than Jose Rivera's. No offense to Jose Rivera from Haunted Mask 1, but you did kind of write some mild cringe jokes. Haunted Mask 2 is a little more fun, way more iconic, more quotable, and funnier. But most importantly, it delivers, I think, like I said, the scariest episode of the whole show. And I'll stand by that. So yeah, that's my ranking of the R.L. Stine specials. Like I said before, let me know down in the comment section, what will your ranking look like? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.